mediocre churches don't get criticized. Lukewarm leaders don't get criticized. I think some people have very strong reactions because there were violations of the liturgy, especially out of Vatican II. And traditional Latin Mass, people make it sound like Jesus came out with the Latin Mass, and that's what he gave. No, it's had expressions over 2,000 years. We respect the authority of the church. We are under authority. And we respect that authority, but if there's new ways we can do things that both respect the liturgy, the authority we're under, we're going to try them. We're going to do them.
Well, Tom Corcoran, thanks so much for being here today. I guess I'm at your work, but thanks for letting me be here.
Sure. Thanks for coming up, Austin.
I'm really excited about this. So the backstory of this is I came here unannounced and kind of went to a service here at Church of the Nativity here in Timonium, Maryland. Church of the Nativity, right?
You got it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it was a fascinating experience. I described it as like a Catholic megachurch. How did you feel about that description?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, it doesn't bother me. In fact, I think megachurch has become a negative word. It's almost become a slur in many people's minds. So I think I do care about that because I'm not sure that's always fair. But no, that doesn't bother me. In some ways, I would say our vision many years ago was to be a Catholic megachurch in that sense. So in some ways, I know not everybody takes it positively to hear that. That can be very negative for some people. It's not for me, and in some ways it kind of is affirming of a vision we had here.
Okay, awesome. And I mean, numbers aren't everything, but this is a very big church. Average weekend, how many people are here?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just looking at our screen. So, we're in summer now, so that's, obviously ebbs and flows right now. You'll get about 2,000 to 2,400 in the summer. It can go up to 3,000, close to 3,000 when we get to the bigger months. We also have about 2,000 people usually online, which, so again, post-COVID, I think, you could talk about that if we want to get into that, but those people that represents people as well. And, I just always think about numbers and it's, maybe other people have said this to you before, but numbers are people. Yeah. And when people say, well, God doesn't care about numbers, well, why is there a book of the Bible called Numbers? And that's not original with me, but that's a pretty good question. And most parishes, most churches, they count the money. Are you counting people? What's more important? So
I think it was Andy Stanley who first pointed out to me that the word crowd is in almost every chapter of the book of Mark, and just kind of in these conversations. But something that was missing, I think, in my initial reflection. So I came, I experienced the service. I referred to you as some random dude, which I'll never live down.
Yeah, that was funny. My kids laughed at it. It was great.
Good. I'm glad I could provide some comic relief. But something I didn't realize, so I shared my reflections, and overall, I really enjoyed it. But I got even more intrigued as I started getting emails and comments from people of saying, what's really remarkable about this church is the story of how they got here. So take me through that a little bit, because from what I understand, this hasn't always looked like this. There haven't always been 3,000 people here, books lining the shelves, and this beautiful facility. So how did we get here?
Yeah, and we talk about it in our book Rebuilt, but I mean, the kind of the story is Father Michael came to this parish in the late 90s, and it was, as he would call it, a sleepy parish. The parish had begun in 1968, right after Vatican II. So there was a whole wave that started that said, okay, let's serve God in our generation, and the church is doing a new thing, and we want to be part of that. But unfortunately, and this happens, often, fast forward, nearly 30 years, and that same spirit had died. Like, they just wasn't there anymore. And there just really wasn't a lot going on at this parish. And Father Michael came as a young pastor and was very wise in the beginning, didn't really do very much to change things. But the previous pastor had been here for decades. And as soon as he started doing even little things, people got upset. So you kind of had to move the pace of change. But, I mean, they were upset that the pastor was gone, time has gone by. So anyway, the parish was a sleepy parish. He brought me in about a year later. Over time, learned, again, we needed to get new staff. We were here for about 6 years working together. I was doing youth ministry. And we were working really hard. So the parish really didn't have anything going on. And then we started doing a lot of stuff. So I was in youth ministry. I did crab feast. I did ski trips. I did lock-ins. I did everything. Ran the confirmation program, religious education. Catholic Heart work camp. Everything. I was just doing a lot. And that's better than nothing. But it was a lot of activity and busyness without purpose. And for me, and this might be your case too, I would guess, books have had a profound impact on me. I can tell you certain books when I read them and how they changed my life. And one of the books for me was Purpose Driven Youth Ministry by Doug Fields. And I just read it, and I'm like, that's my problem. I don't have a purpose. I don't know the why behind the what of what I'm doing. And so that started us on a journey. And Father Michael had always been really open. He would share articles. We shared an article about Willow Creek and their cafe. So and we worked together. So I began sharing these thoughts and ideas with Father Michael, shared them with our parish council. He would come to me like, that's really good stuff. And so eventually that led us on a trip to Saddleback Church where, and again, we talk about that's just like stepping on a different planet. We're like, what is going on here? And maybe some negative reaction at first, but at the same time, you're like, this doesn't happen by accident. God did something here, and I don't even know if we would articulate that way, and these people have figured something out we don't know. And so that began us on a journey of learning from evangelical churches. Saddleback's one, North Point's another one, Fellowship Church in Dallas, Willow Creek. Those are kind of the primary ones. And we would just take what we learned there and bring them into our context. And of course, again, never compromising our Catholic faith. That's core to who we are. But I think that created a dynamism of taking those concepts and figuring out how they worked in a Catholic setting. Also, in just going to those, we grew as leaders. I would say any growing parish has a growing leader. And so I'm grateful to Saddleback and all those experiences because they taught me ways to grow in my faith.
There's so much that I want to dig into.
Yeah, so I was going to keep going.
No, it's so fascinating. And what's really interesting to me is that's the world I grew up in. So I grew up in the non-denominational evangelical world in which, we hosted the Global Leadership Summit every year, from Willow Creek. We were very embedded in that. And I like to say I grew up in church sound booths. Like that was kind of my whole experience. But to see that translated into a Catholic context, which is something I only got into later in life after I got interested in theology, began exploring kind of the history of the church, I never saw those two worlds meeting, right? So I thought, I had this really dynamic kind of faith upbringing in my evangelical church and that there's so much good in that. And, maybe there's things that I would see as like, okay, maybe we could do that better, right? And then I got exposed to the Catholic and Orthodox churches and I thought, wow, this is so different. And what was fascinating was coming here is that it was both different and the same, if you will. So there was still that Catholic identity, which was different to me from what I grew up with, but the format was so similar. And so I want to know what that was like when you started bringing these ideas to the parish, because you mentioned that when Father Mike first came here, he got some pushback, people with change in general, but that had to be really interesting for the congregation to experience something that had to be very different for them. What was that like? Hey, I hope you guys are enjoying this video, but one thing I know people don't always enjoy is the ads that go with these videos. Now look, ads are how YouTubers like me are able to pay the bills, but if you want to watch these videos early, ad-free, and with my post-show reflections at the end, you can do so by becoming a patron at any tier by going to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. From $7 a month to $100 a month, your support helps this channel keep going and growing. And not only will you get early ad-free access to these interviews, but you will also get access to the Gospel Simplicity Book Club, where we read the Church Fathers together, and it is an absolute blast. So if you want those perks and others, go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity.
Yeah, I mean, and again, that's a whole story in itself in the sense, or, it's not all even, right? So you try some things and they work, and some things you get pushback on. So one of the ways for us that was big was we had a 5:30 Sunday night mass. And unlike sort of the other things, no one really cared about it. So it was a good place for sort of to try ideas and see what would work. And so in that place, again, it met with very little resistance. And especially, too, we were aiming at high school students, middle school students, younger families, so they were open to new things as well. Again, so some of the things we did learn is preaching, and the importance of that. So in some ways you can just improve preaching, right? That doesn't matter, and people appreciate that. Maybe you speak a little longer. The message series, now that's a new idea. And again, we would do that at Sunday night, and that was fine. Then you kind of introduced it in the church. And I don't remember a lot of pushback on that. Same thing, we introduced the screens. We only did them on Sunday night. And then there's a whole story to that, or kind of process to that. And then we saw that was so we saw all these things working, kind of beta testing them, and like that crowd was growing. And as that's growing, like, well, why don't we just take that and bring it into the rest of the church? So, probably the biggest change here there was, as I don't remember any specifics except for one, as the cultures were starting to collide, and you're trying to transform and change things. There's a famous speech Father Michael gave in 2006. We call the "Get Off the Bus" speech, and I think, anyway, various things, but saying, hey, we are. And a couple of years we had introduced, we're going to be a different kind of church. We're going to, we especially in, I remember at Advent 2004, it said, we did our first kind of message series to the whole church. And more, it was kind of like, hey, this is the history, kind of like past, present, future. We kind of talked about the past, like here are all these churches that are closing. I mean, this is even back in the late 90s, there was rumblings of this. And I think that Father Michael was very prophetic in this. It's like churches are closing. If we don't do something different, that's going to be our story too. And told the whole story of all these Catholic parishes closing, again, which is small at that point compared to what's going on now. And then I forget, the second week was something about the present. But then we painted a picture for the future, and especially we stole from Saddleback Sam to Timonium Tim and talked about our plan. It was really about our whole plan of growth, even if we didn't understand it. And we launched that. People, you do a whole message and they're like, okay, nothing until you actually start changing things. People don't really care. And then we started doing certain things. So the two major areas where we just, now you couldn't shake it. Like you could kind of probably hide a little bit or pretend things weren't happening, but there were two events that were huge that then changed the whole culture. And it didn't matter who you were as a parishioner, it was going to hit you. And one was in 2005. We decided to take our Christmas Eve masses and move them to the fairgrounds, which is about a mile away from here. And we were not having mass here on Christmas Eve. And we had Father Michael had a major donor column, giving the biggest donor at all, and said, "If you go there, I am not going. I'm leaving the church and taking my money." And Father White said, "Okay," So that was just a big thing, saying, to the whole parish, saying, we are going to be different. We do not exist just for us. The church exists not for the church people, but for the world. And then in 2006 for Lent, we did purpose-driven life, and we read the book, and we invited everybody to get in a small group, and we put a tent out front and said, we want everybody in a small group this Lent. And you had to go around the tent, and some people actually got stuck in the tent because they didn't want to go through the tent. And we're going to make you walk through the tent to say, I'm not a part of this, or walk through and give you the opportunity. So those were kind of two major times we invited everybody. And then later in 2006, Father Michael did a kind of get off the bus. Really, this is where we're going. And if you don't want to be a part of it, if I'm never going to be engaging, maybe you need to find a church where you'll get engaged.
Wow. There's so much to take away from that whole story from a leadership perspective of the incremental changes, but also having kind of a boldness to say, this is where we're going. And, this isn't going to be for everyone. You mentioned something in there, though, that I think is really important to hit on that people might have lost. So you talked about Saddleback Sam and Timonium Tim. Talk about Timonium Tim a little bit and how the kind of vision of who are we trying to reach as a church? I think that's connected to it, but let us into that a little.
Yeah, and and seeing some of your podcasts or the one you did on that, obviously you're talking to a lot of church people, and I kind of feel like personally I'm a little bit of both. I'm a church person, but not I grew up an altar boy in Philadelphia. I remember at times thinking how cool the Easter Vigil was at that point and that kind of stuff, and I kind of got into it. At the same time, I didn't go in the priesthood. I didn't choose that kind of life, and so Timonium Tim. First of all, is the quintessential unchurched person in our community, who for us in Baltimore probably grew up Catholic, or at least has had some experience with the Catholic Church or going to a Catholic school here. But his concept of church is always as boring and bad and irrelevant to my life. Personally, when I think of the Tims, I think of two groups. I think of my high school friends who still go to church, but I don't think the church has ever engaged them. I don't think, I think it still is a kind of check the box. They go to church because they should, and they grew up Catholic, and they're good people. but they've never got switched on for Christ. I don't know if I'd say they have a personal relationship with Jesus. I don't think they've seen the full gospel, and it's not their fault, because quite honestly, I don't think the parishes they're in have ever really explained the full gospel to them or have done anything to switch them on. Then I think about my friends from college who are more heathens, pagans, and I don't know, and a couple of them, and I don't know where they are in their faith now, but they grew up Catholic but really never went to church, and it was definitely not anything they did. And so for me, those are kind of like what fuels me is trying to reach those people. I want them to know the goodness of the gospel. I want to know how much God wants to use them, how incredible it is to have a relationship with Jesus. And so Timonium Tim is that quintessential person in our community, but for me personally, that's who I think of.
I love that. And you're absolutely right. A lot of the people that watch my videos are church people. And they're not just church people. They're like in the weeds church people. Like they're reading the papal encyclicals over breakfast kind of people. And I love them. Like, you guys are theology nerds and I love you deeply. I'm one of them. But that's not everyone. And I think it might be helpful. I mean, you talked about this a little bit, but for people to get a sense of what Baltimore is like, because we're here in kind of, what is this, northwest Baltimore here? North of Baltimore, in the suburbs here. And Baltimore and Maryland in general, it feels like a very like culturally Catholic, but not very necessarily like super actively engaged. You talked about closing parishes. It was last year that the Archdiocese of Baltimore announced that at least in the city, like half of the parishes were going to be closed. And that has to do with, changing demographics and everything. But something I appreciate about what you guys are doing is, like, you're not closing your eyes to that, because I think a lot of people want to say, like, that's the world's problem, or that's, that's on everyone else. They should be coming to church. We're just going to do our thing. And if they don't like it, that's them. But you guys seem to really be seeing like, hey, this is where God has placed us as a church, and we've got to reach these people. Is that fair?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I just want to go back a little bit too. I want to applaud you for your self-awareness, I think, or anybody. There are people who, you'd say geek out or nerd out on some of those things. And I will be honest, that's not me. But I think that's fine. That's great. But be aware of it. Yeah. And then, yes, like, we have to care about people. And I think, again, the problem with the church is it becomes clubby. And again, there should be places to discuss these things. That's good, but we have to be careful if that becomes clubby and we're not trying to reach. The church, again, does not exist for us. It exists for the world. And if not for the sacrifice of other people who cared about people knowing Jesus, generations, and spreading the gospel, none of us would be here and have the privilege of knowing Jesus. So I think that's not, I don't know, that is what I have learned from evangelical churches. Again, there was nothing in me, and we talk about sharing your faith, and we are trying to open. I still feel like personally, so much more growth more room to grow. I just at an evangelical conference last week, and I'm just always amazed how much they keep that front and center. And I don't go about my day thinking, how am I going to reach someone for Jesus today? Like, often I'm like, I got business to get done, and I go about my day. And so it's a lot easier as a church person to say, all right, how are we welcoming versus trying to live that out in my daily life. But yeah, I think as much as we can, you got to keep. But the reason we define that Timonium Tim is because it helps us to remember that's our target and that's who we're trying to reach.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about what's going on here, and then we'll get into some of the things that people from my audience were curious when I first came across this. But you mentioned, I forget if it was 2006, 2008, somewhere along that timeline, you guys started getting really into small groups. Now, for me, that was always a mainstay of the church life. We always talked about their Sunday, but if you really want to use your language, switched on in your faith, if you really want to be going deep, like, you've got to be in a small group. This is where life, what did we always say growing up? Change happens best in small groups, kind of thing, or something like that. And it's so true. Like, and I know for my wife and I, we've having the experience. We bought a house last year, being able to host groups at our house. Now we love it. Getting to do that in our church. I understand how I'm not in deep enough to the Catholic world at parish level. Like, how novel was that when you said we're bringing small groups to a Catholic church, and how has that kind of grown for Nativity?
Yeah, it was completely novel. And I'm kind of the pioneer in our parish. Like, we start new things, so I was on that in the very beginning, and I always, struggled, like, even telling people how to engage in the church. Well, you can tell people to give because people kind of understand. I mean, Catholics are good at closing their eyes to it, but it costs money to run this place. And yeah, you need to give to it. And people could understand volunteering. I volunteer at my kid's school. I coach a team, but what is a small group, right? So what are you talking about? So I think there was just some explanation of that and continued explanation of what that is. And it was not that, and so that's why we had to make a huge concerted effort. Like, this is what we want you to do for Lent. We're not asking you to, again, and that is where we could leverage Lent in the sense that Catholics understand, okay, Lent, you try to do something a little bit deeper to go in your faith. And so we're saying, don't give up chocolate or coffee for Lent, go do something instead. So Lent was a good time. But so it was very novel. And it took many years for us to ingrain that in the culture. And that's where you just got to keep saying it 64,000 times. I've heard someone say, until you've said it 7 times, someone hasn't heard it for the first time yet. So we just had to keep coming back at it, hammering like, no, we're really committed to this. We're not just saying, one of the things I learned, I think it's from Saddleback, are you going to be a church with small groups or of small groups? And that preposition sounds not like much, but the with is, it's something we kind of do. And of is, no, that's clear about what we do. And we're going to figure out every way we can to get you in a group. So we kind of made that decision, can continue to work on that. But yeah.
I love that. And I want to talk a little bit more about Timonium Tim and how small groups feature in this. But, you've got this guy, let's say it's, a high school friend who grew up Catholic. He's no longer engaged in the Catholic faith. Maybe he goes to Mass, maybe he doesn't. Maybe Christmas and Easter, something like that. And you say, like, this is the guy we're trying to reach here at Church Nativity. What is that kind of like, I don't know if you guys use this language, but like growth journey look like for him, right? So what is it that you want to see for these people who, maybe grew up in the Catholic faith but are disconnected now? Is it, you want them coming to Mass, you want them in a small group? Like, what does that trajectory look like for someone coming in here and then really flourishing?
Yeah, I think some churches are really have very detailed in how that goes. I think we have a general view, but I don't know if, others might be more dialed in. But in the sense of, the first thing is always, if the person's not coming to church, you want them to start coming to church and seeing themselves as part of the faith community. And hopefully that also is going to mean that they're being moved in when they come to a weekend Mass by either, we would say music, message, and minister. So either the hospitality as they come in, you talk about the parking lot. And so hopefully it might be they're just moved that someone smiled at them that week, right? People get discouraged all week long, and have someone smile at you and say, we're glad you're here. That feels good, right? And especially, again, for the unchurched person, they might not know they're welcome, right? And churches will say, of course everyone can come to church. That's not always the vibe churches give or the way people feel. So hopefully maybe that, or hopefully they're just going to connect with some people, and then, but hopefully the music's going to move his heart, and he's going to, maybe he's going to connect with God through that in some way, and there's going to be, just the music played, a verse, something, a chorus, a verse that are spoken, and of course then the homily. So in some ways we are hoping through the whole Mass, we're taking you on a spiritual journey that Father Michael calls it a progressive solemnity, that you're moving from very kind of secular, greeting at the door, but into the sacred, which is the Eucharist. So hopefully we've helped you take that. And every week you think, I moved a little closer to God in some way, or I feel good about being here. Then we do talk about eventually steps of discipleship. And I think you kind of talked about it in your thing. It's pretty much like every evangelical church. And I think it's like that because they're pretty much universal. Yeah. So we do say we want to take you to take 5 steps of discipleship, and that the way I look at it, it's like to be a well-developed Christ follower, you kind of need these 5 tools. So we would say serve in ministry or missions, tithe and give, engage in small groups. We want to help you practice prayer and sacraments, and we want to help you share your faith. That is having a heart for people outside. And on each of those, we can go deeper of what I think. I think those steps do 2 things. One, they build personal faith, but they also build the corporate body. And that's those 2 things have to always come together. The church, and I think as a churches, we can get focused on one or the other. It's all about building our church, right? Well, no, it's not. Or we get too focused. It's all about your personal relationship with Christ, right? Well, no, it's not all about that. But yes, it's both and that's, to me, the Catholic answer is usually both and. And so it's both building people's personal faith and helping them put on the character of Christ and building up the corporate body of believers.
I want to follow up on that both and in just a second. There's one more aspect, though, of the kind of Sunday experience, or in my case, I think I came on a Saturday experience of this church that was unique to me. And again, I'm speaking as someone like, I know Catholicism through books. I don't know it through parish life. So maybe this isn't as unique as I think it is. But the children's ministry, that was always huge for me. Like I grew up always in kind of, children's ministry. I served in children's ministry forever. And, my wife and I have still done that since we've gotten married, and we love doing that. But when I saw that seemed novel to me in a Catholic church. Is that novel? Talk to me a little bit about, what you guys are doing and the vision for that.
Yes and no. I mean, I think one of the things you saw probably was we call Time Travelers, which is Children's Liturgy of the Word program. Now, parishes across the country have a Children's Liturgy of the Word program. Now, quite honestly, it's often a second thought. It's often like, all right, get the kids out of here, give them a break from church, and maybe have somebody stand up there and read the readings. And at least you got the kids out of the room, and at least they got to move a bit, And I'm exaggerating that. I think there are people who put more effort, but for us is we have it's evolved into a full-time staff person, and she does some other things, but that's her program is the Time Travelers and the Children's Literature program, and putting together engaging content that will help them have a message for them. So that's not any different from other Catholic churches, and probably Children's Liturgy of the Word program. I mean, I didn't go to one as a kid. I'm 51, but I remember, like, by the time I was like in high school or late middle school, we had started one, which is kind of the way I described to you. An older gentleman standing up there and reading the readings to kids, not necessarily engaging kids in a way they can understand. So in that sense, it's everywhere. The other thing we have pushed, again, is the nursery, or kids under, and there's a great conflict in the Catholic world about that. I don't know if you've ever seen, like, in the sense of those little kids should be in church, and I've just never understood that, and I don't understand it because, again, just my own personal experience growing up. I've gone to church my whole life, but that started in first grade. Because I'm the oldest. My mom told me the story that as a baby, my parents took me to church. I wailed and cried the whole time, and they came home, and my dad said to my mom, "All right, this is the deal. You'll go to church. I'll stay with the kid. Then you go to church, and I'll stay. Well, whatever. They reversed that, and that's just what we did. And because there wasn't an environment for little kids, so we did learn that from evangelical churches, that you actually have programs for little kids, and you are partnering with parents and providing those programs. So So again, that's the harder sell, I think, in most Catholic parishes, because there are people. Tolkien said something about this that people quote about little kids in church and there's life, and I honestly don't get it. I don't understand it. When I had little kids, the greatest thing in the world was being able to drop my kids off at a program, knowing they're forming some relationships with some other people, getting a message, designed for them in some way, and I could sit with my wife and actually pay attention and worship.
Yeah, I won't, solve these debates today. But I'll say, just from my own experience, I think I don't want to make this like too dramatic, but I wonder how different my life would be if my earliest memories of church weren't consistently positive. Like I always loved going to church, and what a gift that was for me. Like, going to church never felt like, oh, I've got to go to church, but I was excited to. That's where my friends were, and it engaged me at a level that made sense.
And little kids are the easiest to do, and programs, quite honestly, they don't have to be that complex to reach little kids. Again, we put a lot into the elementary school program, but little kids are just happy, again, a place to play, and I don't know how. Again, not trying to pick the fight here, but maybe I would. Like you said, if the parents are stressing out that they're trying to keep you under control, kids feel that, they know that. So it makes sense to me. Anyway, we could debate that at some other point or another. But anyway, yeah. So exactly that. We are working hard that little kids, children, teenagers say, "I like coming to church. I like being here." Of course, again, it's not the whole point, but it's a lot of the point.
So this discussion of, where kids are in the service brings up one of the bigger questions I think that came up when people watched my video was, first of all, they just wanted to know, like, are you guys following the rubrics here? Because this looks different, right? You see the big worship. It seems like, wait, have they like gone off the rails? But when we talked a little bit, I was on their Rebuilt podcast, and I think we talked about this before, and I'll link that in the description. But you mentioned, there's guardrails for this, right? Like, we can't just do anything, because we've used the word experiment, and people might have been on the edge of their seat since then. So talk to me a little bit about the breadth that the Catholic Church gives you in being able to try new things without completely just like freewheeling this.
Yeah, it's fine. I think the Catholic culture, in many ways, the culture does not always promote trying new things, but I think the Catholic Church actually does. Like, for example, I mean, I'll use more on Scripture, just to use that to start there. And I'm more safer on Scripture than I am on the liturgy, I will admit. But Scripture, there's very few passages of Scripture where the Catholic Church says this, and you need to believe it, right? I mean, there are some, but there's a lot of flexibility in how you interpret Scripture and understand Scripture. And again, we need to stay to the literal true meaning and all that, but again, that we can take it and there's a flexibility to it. With the Mass, there are rubrics and we need to follow them, and again, I think some people have very strong reactions because there were violations of the liturgy, especially out of Vatican II. I mean, certain things, like, again, I've heard crazy things. I've never experienced them, but like someone, a priest trying to confect cake or something like that, and we can't. It's bread and wine, right? Jesus gave us that, right? So, I personally, again, I just leave it to, I'm not the ordained priest here. Father Michael's the pastor. He went through the training. Father Michael has helped with Mass in Rome, in the Vatican. He was the papal Mass here in Baltimore. So I just figure he knows what he's doing. So I think as it looks different, people start to think, well, there must be something wrong with it. There must be something. And, and there are things people accuse us of. And Father Michael's like, that's the way they do it in Rome. Or even, they did there was just a whole youth gathering, and like they had screens. Some of the way in which we distribute communion, he's like, well, that's how they do it when they have large gatherings in Rome. Like, it's not getting away with anything. We don't want to do that. It's like, that's how you do it. So I think maybe because it's not always done that way, if it's just done different, somehow it must be wrong. Or if 99% of my experience has been this, then that 1% must be something wrong with it. But I think a lot of that is, it's optics more than the reality.
Yeah. I mentioned this in the first video that I made about coming to Church of the Nativity, and talked about how it was a beautiful expression of like the universality of the Catholic Church. And one of my dear friends who's a Catholic theologian responded to me via text, and he said, actually, I'd prefer you translate that as wholeness. He's like, but good point. But those are the type of people that watch my videos.
Yeah. And language matters on those things. And
it does. But he actually was making a good point. And he's like, what the Catholic Church is trying to do isn't trying to be universal in the sense of doing the same thing in the same way in every place.
Yes.
It's trying to bring everything together into like an integral wholeness. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective, because you've got all these different rites in the Catholic Church, right? You have different ways of doing it within a unified body. And it seemed like this is another expression of what the Catholic faith could look like. And I found that just fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, get me to pick another fight or not.
All of them.
I had a professor, I remember, theology talked about sometimes traditional Latin Mass people make it sound like Jesus came out with the Latin Mass, that's what he gave. No, it's had expressions over 2,000 years. And, I do think, and obviously from the Council of Trent until Vatican Council II, there was a Tridentine Mass, and there was a uniformity. But the gospel to go forward needs to be enculturated in some ways. And that's what, and again, I think that's the beauty of, the Novus Ordo Masses. We do have that opportunity for it to be enculturated, and to, again, while there being a core that's untouchable, but to be able to reach different communities. I went to, it wasn't a Mass, but I was in Kenya, Ulu, Kenya. And we went to the Catholic Church, shortage of Catholic priests, so it wasn't a Mass, it was but it had ways of a communion service, but again, looked very different. And they get up for the offering, and they get up and they start dancing for 15 minutes, and that's a beauty to me, and that's, to me, the flexibility of the Catholic Church that, unfortunately, and I get people go to the Catholic Church, and especially I think your generation, like, so much is crazy right now. There's so much crazy in our culture. Like, I want stability. And I think that is the appeal of traditional Latin Mass and I think it's a beautiful Mass. I totally do. I think that's some of the appeal, but I think we have to also appreciate the flexibility it gives to reach a culture.
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of a pendulum swing going on there of people being really interested in the Latin Mass today, especially, people like me. When I see evangelicals who become Catholic and then get very into that world, I think so many of them, and I'll kick the hornet's nest too, so that you're not alone here. We'll spark all the controversies. No, but I see a lot of people kind of like disdaining their evangelical upbringing and kind of bashing it. And I often think like, hey, like I get it. Like you found things that you think are lacking in that. But man, like you probably wouldn't love the faith. Like you probably wouldn't have even been interested in Catholicism if it wasn't for this kind of church that you grew up in. And that's not to say that church was better or worse, but I think there's so much love for tradition and liturgy right now, and I think that's great. But I think it also only really works when you also have that dynamism. And some people already had that as their upbringing, and some other people find it on their own. But what I love that you guys are giving here is that emphasis on like a real personal relationship, a real, being switched on in your faith, taking ownership of this and not just being kind of this passive participant in a Mass that goes by you. So I really appreciate that.
Well, I think it's true. The same thing happens in the Catholic Church. I think there are people who grew up, and it's interesting, new generations, but for my generation or others who grew up in the Catholic Church, and I always say I grew up Philly Catholic, which I mean I really feel like I had a great foundation for the doctrine and dogma of the church and like the foundational truths. Like now there wasn't a lot of personal relationship, so you can get mad. Well, why didn't they give me the personal relationship? Well, they gave me what they could give. They gave me what they gave me. Be grateful for that. And in some ways, our faith is it is a lifelong exercise. So no matter what you got, you're not going to get all of it. So I agree. I think that's just a healthy attitude. Like, and I think you have to learn the same thing with parents. Like no matter who you are, at some point you realize your parents were imperfect people who did not give you everything you needed, and you can get bitter about that and you can get mad at them, or you can be very grateful for them. One of the things I said to my dad right before he died is like the longer I'm a father, the more I understand how great a dad you were. So, and I think hopefully maybe the longer people are in their faith, maybe they can appreciate a little bit more how much they got as kids, even if it wasn't everything.
Yeah, I think that's really wonderful. And it segues into a question I have about what you guys are doing here in general. Because one of my, I don't know if concern is too strong, but the uniqueness of what you guys are doing seems both a real pro, but maybe a con as well. And something that I was considering is, at least in my experience of living in this area, it's a very transient area. Like people come in here for work, they work at one of the military bases, or they're all defense contractors pretty much, and then they move in a bit. Maybe it's more transient.
Yeah, it's probably where you are. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm closer down towards Fort Meade, I guess. But, people are always coming in and out. It feels like no one is from here. But even if that's not the case, one of my concerns was that someone would come here and they'd love it, and this would be the Catholic faith for them. Like it looks like this, and then they move, name any other state,
right.
And they can't find this. Is that something that you guys run into, that people struggle? Like, hey, I'm a Nativity Catholic, like I'm one of them, but I don't relate to the rest of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I think it's a valid question. I think it's a very valid question. And, I guess on one hand, I'm like, well, what do you want us to do?
Yeah, no, it's not your fault.
On one hand, and there's some, and we struggle with the technology because we're so far advanced of any other Catholic church now, and we're trying to influence other Catholic parishes. And so someone's like, well, like, don't do your job as well. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. We're going where we felt like God is, like, so here's how I answer. I'm like, we're doing what we feel like God has called us to do. It has borne fruit. And yes, there's ways in which, sometimes we will ask questions and we're like trying to, well, how'd you grow in your faith with God? And all they do is talk about nativity. And like, okay, well, we appreciate that, but we really want you to talk about God, not us, right? And so that's a continual way in your leading that you need to pay attention to. At the same time, to me, the church, the church is the bride of Christ. And so in some ways they should be inseparable. In some ways your church experience should be inseparable from Christ. Like, it's good. There's a goodness to that. And then we are trying to help other parishes take this, and it's an organization called Rebuilt. We're trying to take what we've learned and help it not be, not us be such an exception, not be such an outlier. And I hope in some ways, or when we started doing this, or when we saw growth and fruit, we wrote our book Rebuilt because we want to see this become, maybe more the norm, or maybe more like, again, sometimes like we get criticized. Well, I'm like, well, so is mediocrity what we should be aiming at? And I did a blog about this. Like, it's very interesting because mediocre churches don't get criticized. No. Lukewarm leaders don't get criticized. Yeah. Why? Because you don't know who they are. Because not doing anything. Yeah. Who do we criticize? We often criticize someone who's doing something right. And are they doing everything right? No, of course not. Are we doing everything right? No. Are there problems, struggles, things that we don't get right here? Absolutely. But it's, I don't know, Theodore Roosevelt. It's not the critic who counts. It's where he who points out the strong man stumbles. It's the doer of the deeds. And so the bigger problem in the church is lukewarm, mediocre leaders who don't sacrifice and aren't willing to try something new. That's the bigger problem, I would argue. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, of all the problems to have, it would be a really good problem if someone said my church experience was so positive that I can't feel like I can experience it somewhere else, right? Like,
yeah.
This is, of course, there's good problems and bad problems. This is solidly in the good problem sphere. But that does segue really nice into what you guys are doing with Rebuilt. I think it was like a week after you guys had a conference here, and there was kind of like the highlight reel video of it. It looked huge. I don't know. But talk to me about like the successes, the challenges of trying to take the success that you guys have had and see that come to fruition in other places.
Yeah, it's a slog, quite honestly. It's hard, and I'm sure it can get easier. We haven't figured that out yet. We do work with we call them our partner parishes. These are parishes that are in coaching with us and are really embracing more what we call our model. And so we have about 30 parishes we're working with right now in doing that. We create content, obviously the books, but also our own podcasts, as you mentioned, workshops, and video courses. And so we're trying to do all we can to equip other leaders, again, to take the major principles that we have done and apply them into their parishes.
I love that. And just for curiosity's sake for the audience, is there like a list of those somewhere? Like, for instance, if someone watched my video and they were like, that's super cool, but I don't live in Maryland, like, is there a way they could find out or
no?
not?
There's not at this point. That's something we've thought about, and I'd love it to, people leave Nativity, to your point, and they go, hey, I'm moving here. Is there a parish there yet? And I'm like, 9 times out of 10, 9 times out of 100, it's like, no, there's nothing there yet. We're working, but if you have a parish going, and I've tried to figure out how do we leverage that, people leaving and moving and saying, can you implant these ideas somehow? Can you be a leader in that parish in some way? Haven't figured that out yet. So no, we don't have it. I mean, if someone emailed me, I would say, okay, I can tell you yes or no. But, and even some of the parishes I think that we're working with, we're doing some good things, but they're early on in their work and their progress.
Yeah, and I mean, change takes time, and I imagine change takes a lot longer the bigger the organization you have, right? So the beauty and the downfall of kind of the non-denominational world is you can move fast and break stuff. Like, no one's there to stop you, Yeah. You like what you're doing, your church is growing, you just plant another one. Like, it's pretty simple.
Sometimes I'm jealous of that, yep.
I bet, yeah. At the same time, there's no one to tell you no, and there's no one to tell you no.
That's true.
Like, it's good and bad. And so that does segue into another aspect that people were curious about, was just how has this been received, not necessarily by your parish, but I got a bunch of questions like, does the bishop know about this? And you mentioned that, Father Mike's been involved at the Vatican. And so I'd love to hear, has there been some receptivity or interest, or should we just answer for the record the bishop does know?
Yeah, we can. I mean, yes, we can answer that. And Father Michael and I received a papal award. That's called the
Congratulations.
Thanks. Pro Ecclesia Pontificia Award, and it's given by the Pope. But the reality is that's not happening unless Archbishop Lori makes it happen. So, Bishop Parker, who's the Vicar General for the diocese, is on our board. Very enthusiastic. That's who spoke. That was in that video, and he spoke at our conference. So yes, I mean, at the end of the day, now that is a process of years of different conversations. When we started out, again, and we admit we didn't always do great at communicating up, leading up and telling people. And this is now the third archbishop since we've been here. So, yeah, obviously there's just going to be different relationships with that. But yes, everyone knows. I think we are different, and again, I think we are challenging the status quo, and so again, sometimes it just seems weird. Like, again, I think some people say, I think you almost had that experience. You're like, all right, what the heck is this? And if you don't know the why behind the what, and that takes some time to communicate, people can just turn you off. So continuing to work around. I think the conference was a really good thing for us in helping Baltimore. We were able to bring in a lot of parishes from Baltimore came, and hopefully that changed some of maybe their thoughts about us. I had one pastor come up to me, a priest came up to me, and after the conference said, thank you for the conference. And he said, what I appreciate at your conference, I went to the breakouts. And he's like, when I go to other conferences, the people tell you how great they are and why you should do everything the way they do it. And he said, one of our values is humble authority. And we want to speak with authority. Jesus spoke with authority, but we want to bring that humbly and serve parishes. And he just said, he didn't use those words, but he said, your breakouts, you shared what you knew and you understood and said, we hope you can use this. It wasn't like arrogant, it was humble. So hopefully we've made some progress there.
Yeah, and I think even the people who might have an initial reaction of like, whoa, this is different, I think for the most part, well, maybe, I don't know, you probably receive more of the negative feedback than I do. But I'd like to think that everyone who's Catholic and committed to their faith, they want to see the church grow. Like, we'll say.
Yeah, I was going to qualify that a little bit, but yeah.
But we want parishes opening and not closing. We want Mass full of people and not empty. I mean, some people would prefer it to be empty so no one got in their way and they could just do their thing. But that's a separate problem, and I think there's a beautiful humility on the reception side of looking at this and saying, maybe I wouldn't have set it up like this. This seems weird, but clearly that God is doing something here. And so maybe there's something I can learn. And I was encouraged when I saw reactions like that to the video that I had made, of people saying like, maybe not my cup of tea, but maybe it's what the church needs. And like that, it's not all about just my aesthetic preference.
Yeah, I think people get really scared. It intimidates them when they see growth in the church that's not their cup of tea. And, I understand it. I get it because we want our way to be the way. But I think God's operating on about 10,000 chessboards, so it doesn't have to intimidate us if God's using, something besides us. Again, I would go back to the traditional Latin Mass, and there are communities that are growing. And I've had like someone come back to me and say, well, I think that's what God's using. I'm like, but can't God be using both? It just seems, again, going back to the both and, it seems like God can use a lot of different things, and I think he does. And I think we just have to be very careful when we get very narrow. One, I do think he's only going to use my way to grow and what I'm comfortable with. Well, I mean, I think like Tim Keller kind of puts it like somehow like when God only affirms what you already believe, then who's really God, right? Your ways of doing things have become your idol. And so to keep God on the throne and keep ourselves humble, I think when we acknowledge that God's moving in other places, we acknowledge he's God and we're not. And yes, this is how God's reached me and how I connect with God, but God can be connecting with some other ways.
Yeah. And I think that both and is really helpful here, because something I noted in my video is, and it goes back to your mediocrity comments, like I think that the traditional Latin Mass is booming in some parishes. And I think what draws people in is that it's done with reverence, it's done with respect. And what you guys are doing here seems to be booming, and you guys do all the little details with excellence. I think the thing that doesn't really get anyone out of bed is the like, we're just going to kind of go through the motions, like not really care about it. So at least from my perspective, I love seeing both. And for me, it's like, pick a lane, or whatever you're going to do it really well. Not for the sake of like, it's just a production, but for the sake of like, I think we all like things that are done well. And just as a comment to you guys, what you guys are doing here, you do it well. And I respect that.
Yeah. I think some people, well, thank you. And I think some people, the vision they have of church is only like, there's little thing. I don't know. Like, I'm just thinking about the priest who reverently brings the host up and like you said, I think that becomes the vision of caring about it. And I hear all the time, well, that's a holy priest, because I think the way they, and it becomes a little performance, and I don't mean to say that negatively, but essentially it's how they do it, right, which is a performance. And yeah, that becomes the definition of what is. And again, that's fine if that works for you and that helps lead you to God and draws you in the holiness of God, and it is a reflection of God's holiness. But yes, you can also have a casual environment that's done with excellence and is meant to show God's glory and the closeness of God, the friendship of God. And I think contemporary worship music does show God's holiness too in its own way.
Yeah, and church isn't just about you, right? But there are different people with different preferences, and different styles are going to meet them where they're at. And I think that's a good thing, and again, a reflection of that wholeness, that is on offer within the church and the diversity.
What was the word? So you use wholeness now. What was the critic?
No, I said universal the first time, and Dr. Barnabas Asprey told me, okay. I'd prefer you said whole.
And why did he like that? Why did he want whole?
Because he didn't. Sorry to put you on blast here, but
that's just interesting.
No,
I'm interested in the distinction there.
I think one was like a linguistic thing. I think he thought it was a better translation, but he didn't want it to give the sense of uniformity that he was, and he had come here actually.
Okay.
And he's a convert from Protestantism. Really articulate guy. He's one of the professors of theology at St. Mary's Seminary.
Okay.
But he had a kind of similar reflection to me. He grew up evangelical, and he was like, it's not where they go to church, but he's like, I'm so glad it exists. Like, it's really cool to see that the Catholic Church has this level of flexibility. He's like, I didn't know that was possible.
Right.
And so, yeah, that was kind of the background on that.
Okay, now I was curious.
Yeah. But I want to, I think one of the interesting things that we haven't talked about here, and we should probably do before we wrap up, because I know that you have to prepare for it, is the messages. So something that stood out to me was that, you had the Mass, and the Mass was over, I think, technically, right? Yep. And then you came out as some random dude. No. And you gave a message that I think I said felt at home in almost any kind of evangelical style, just in the presentation of it. Not to talk about theology per se, but talk to me about that. I understood that you were in your summer format, which is different. So you've talked about message series. How does that fit in, and what might that look like on different Sundays?
Yeah, so I mean, we call it summer format. We try to come up with some other plan. We just never figured out a better way to explain it to our community, and that is where, in the summer, to give Father Michael a break because he does most of the preaching here, we have whole Mass. The Mass is literally ended, and then he says, "Stay for the message." So there is even a little homily, but we do preach longer here than most Catholic churches. We preach 20 minutes. Again, you could go back to anyway. So we preach for about 20 minutes.
And that's not long to me.
Yeah, I know it's not long to you. Pope Francis was saying 7 minutes. I would have had a conversation with Pope Francis about that. Maybe, hopefully, one day in heaven I will. But have a fun debate with him. But yeah, so we do that partly in the summer, and a lot of times we try to cover things again that in the Catholic liturgy it's not always easy to do. So, for example, I'm going through the rich young ruler because I've found that as a passage just so deep and so rich in me. Well, you can't spend 6 weeks in a row. I'll be doing it for 6 weeks. You can't do that because the liturgy is giving you new readings every single week. Or sometimes we'll do something on the Our Father or the Creed, right? Or the sacraments, right? And something so we take that opportunity to go deeper in something we really can't do in preaching through the regular school year, so to speak. So partly it's just a way to do something different. It's partly to refresh and reset a little bit, change things up. It does give our community a chance to hear from some different speakers. Again, and that is us respecting the liturgy, that to be speaking in the homily, you need to be ordained. And so I'm not ordained. I'm not a deacon. So that's the way we respect the liturgy. But again, Archbishop Laurie knows we do that. And when he found out, he'd be like, "It's after Mass, yeah, and people stay, yeah, okay."
Can't be mad about people being in church.
Yeah. So so it's working within our faith and what it teaches, and respecting the authority. But sometimes you respect authority, but you can still do things differently, right? Then that's that's kind of what I think that's our whole thing in general. Like, we respect the authority of the church. We are under authority. And we respect that authority, but if there's new ways we can do things that both respect the liturgy, the authority we're under, we're going to try them. We're going to do them. And that's one way that's worked for us. Through the rest of the course of the year, we do message series. And again, I've just found that a best practice, and that's something we are really trying to help other parishes do. Because first of all, just the importance of preaching. It's so important. Again, because of Trent, because of the Protestant Reformation, there's a sort of thing that preaching isn't as important in the Catholic world. And again, it goes back 500 years, but there's still been great preachers in the Catholic world. And so anyway, we're trying to lift up preaching. And to me, the best practice is a message series. Like, I don't know. I always say, it's all been said, if you plan to fail, you fail to plan. You can't plan out 52 weeks a year. You can plan out 4 to 6 weeks. And so we're trying to help parishes do that.
And that seems like a really easy kind of next step. I say easy. I'm sure there's still a lot of pushback to do something like that, but you're not messing with the liturgy. You're just kind of planning how you're going to speak.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be that hard. But it is a big challenge, and we're trying to reemphasize that to parishes because, in some ways you want to get all these volunteers. You got to motivate people to volunteer. If you want to change your preaching, there's a few people who've got to change, and we try to build up a team, but it goes back to the cultural difference. It's just there's a block, and sometimes guys are so, they've been doing it for so long, I don't want to change yet. But, and then there's people throw out all these obstacles that are really not obstacles, but whatever way it gets in their way.
Yeah, maybe easy was the wrong word there. I'm showing my own bias. Remember, move fast and break stuff.
It should be easy. We're working on it.
Well, no, that's wonderful. And I think this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you again for your time. I'd like to close by just allowing you a second. We've touched on it in different ways, but specifically on your vision for what you would love to see happen. So you guys have written the Rebuilt book. You guys are working on helping parishes. But if someone's out there maybe listening and they're saying like, wow, this is really cool. I would love to see this come to my parish. One, like, what is it that you want to see happen? And two, what advice would you give to someone? Because it's going to be hard. It might be an uphill battle, but what can people start to think about?
And some of what I shared in that week you were here is, I always call it the Ezekiel 37 vision. I don't know why, but that passage has just always spoken to me. And, and over time, over years, I've realized more. And I still feel like even speaking on it, I'm like, there's more. I don't know. Like, that's the beauty of Scripture. It's always like, I got it, but I don't got it, when something really speaks to you. But it is that the dried, dead bones coming back to life again, that people dead in their faith, either not going to church or going to church, coming back to life. And then he says, describes it an exceedingly vast army. And I've always kind of used, then in Revelation, it's pretty cool. Sometimes you make these connections. I think it's Revelation 7 where he sees 144,000. And I read a commentary on that, and like, that's militaristic. There's actually military terms because of the way they're counting, and it's an allusion to that. So like, I've always connected the dots to that's what we want to do, is raise up that vast army. And of course, the vast army of Christ followers is people, again, switched on their faith, people on fire for Christ, and so that we're dead. And again, to me, it's some of those high school friends, those college friends, like really getting to know Jesus, and then serving, giving, engaging, sharing their faith with people in their world. Like, we'd love to see hundreds of parishes come to that. Like, and I would love to see thousands, but love to be a part of that movement that awakens parishes to be producing that. Again, the problem in parishes is we don't produce that, and that's what parish should do, is producing that vast army. So that's kind of the vision. I mean, someone who's like, how do I get started? It always depends upon what your level of authority is. God works through authority. So, I mean, for pastors and priests, I would love you reach out to us at Rebuilt, go to rebuiltparish.com and have a conversation with us. And we will love to have a conversation with you and partner with you in that. For somebody who's in a parish watching this and wants to see that, I think always get involved in your parish, serve the pastor, serve the team in some way, make a contribution, and then that wins authority to be able to say, hey, I'd love to see us move in this direction. How can I help with that?
I love that. Well, Tom, thank you so much, and thanks to all of you all for watching this. I'll be sure to put links in the description so that people can check out all of the good work that you guys are doing here.
All right, thanks, Austin. This was great.